Hi all, I hope everyone is well. We're going to talk about Mara Bar Serapion, and the wise king of the Jews. Quote, today it's posed as one of the pagan references to Jesus. It's a very small quote, really. He's talking about something else, but he does mention a wise king of the Jews, and we must remember that Jesus Christ is called a king of the Jews, but he was not a king in any realistic way, nor in any historical context. He was to religious Christians, and this guy was a pagan. But we're going to go through that today and just explain how it's very unlikely that we can use this as any kind of eyewitness testimony for the historical Jesus. He does come up sometimes as a pagan mention, and it would be reasonable to assume he might be. This might be valid if Mara Bar Serapion was alive and well in the 70s. Some people believe that he wrote this in the 70s. But again, it's a really small reference, and there are kings of the Jews that might actually fit fit this title better, who are actually kings. And then also the problem that this is quite likely to be a late reference. So if he's picked it up at all, it's probably based on New Testament literature or Christians anyway. So again, it's not really particularly valid, strong evidence if he's only getting this from Christian sources a couple of hundred years later as well. So this is just him rehashing or just quoting Christians about Jesus. But again, it's an interesting quote. I've left it out. I have referenced him before. I've talked about this a little bit before, but I've never really been into the weeds with this one. So I thought I'd just do that today for thoroughness, in order to be comprehensive on what I'm covering here. So this is the introduction. Then would be the Syriac letter of Mara Bar Serapion, preserved in a 7th century manuscript. So it's actually from the 7th century that we get this. It's in the British Library. Contains a much discussed passage referring to a wise king of the Jews who was unjustly killed, after which the Jews were punished and dispersed. While the king lived on in the new law he laid down. Okay, traditionally, this has been hailed as one of the earliest non-Christian references to Jesus, yet the text dating, provenance, and interpretation remain highly contested. This essay explores both the possible identities of the wise king and the likelihood of early verses late composition, using a Bayesian framework. So we went a bit Bayesian with this. The text and its theme. Mara's letter, written to his son, compares 3 examples of wise men who suffered unjust deaths. Socrates, executed by Athenians. Pythagoras, said to have been burned and his city covered in sand. The wise king of the Jews, this one, executed by his people, who were later punished and scattered. And the motive is clear. Which wise figures are killed by foolish societies, which then face divine retribution, while the wisdom of the sage lives on. Possible identities of the wise king. So obviously Jesus of Nazareth, the prose known as the King of the Jews. He's only known as the King of the Jews in history and written down by about the 150s anyway. So this is probably, even if we want to be generous and say that he was writing in, say, the 2nd century, Mara here, it's not until probably after the Gospels are written that he's writing about this. But we'll see why it's probably not the case, and he's writing many decades, if not centuries later. Remembered for founding a new teaching, his death was linked by later Christians to the fall of Jerusalem, cons, not named explicitly, okay, survives through law rather than resurrection, reflects a stoicized non-Christian view. So he's still talking like a Greek, a pagan, I should say. Josiah now, this is interesting. 640 to 609 BCE. This is Aldocity's proposal. I've got his book, I've read this, and it's extremely interesting. Actually, it goes to some degree actually saying that this might be this the reference here, Pros, a former king who enacted new laws in Deuteronomy and Deuteronomy reform. His death was followed by Judah's decline into exile. Ancient like Socrates and Pythagoras. So the two ancient people that Mara references here is alongside in the same time frame as Josiah here. So that might be him. The cons though, too remote chronologically, little is known outside Jewish tradition. Dispersion language fits Rome, not Babylonian exile. Now that's fair to say here, but there are, as I said, other reasons to believe that he might be talking about Josiah. It doesn't really matter though. The probabilities are pretty low, but it is a possibility. Antigonus, the second of Matthias, 4237 BC. The pros here, last Hasmonean king executed by Romans, symbol of Jewish independence crushed. The cons, not as famous as a sage or lawgiver, little remembered in broader Greco-Roman culture. So the generic literary tropes here, prose fits Stoic consolation literature, whereas archetypes often stand in for broad themes. The cons weakens the specificity of Mara's example. So he's a bit specific here. And it's my view that he is actually talking... he might well be talking about Jesus, but it's late, so it's no good for us. Early versus late dating. The argument for early 1st century dating, possible context, Mara writing after Rome's annexation of Samosata, this is 72 CE, Jesus already known in Syria by this time. That's disputed. We don't know whether he was or not. This is too late to really say anything concrete. Early to say anything concrete, and we have no evidence for this. Just speculation. Okay, arguments for late dating. 2nd to 4th century manuscript evidence only survives in a 7th century Syriac manuscript. No earlier witnesses to this. Ambiguous historical context. Nothing in the letter ties it securely to the 72 CE. The captivity described could reflect later conflicts under Rome. The Jewish punishment motif. Mara writes in the present tense of Jews being scattered, which fits the post-Bar Kokhba period after 135 CE. More strongly than the 70 CE period. Philosophical and theological themes, the blend of Stoic consolation and the idea that the Jews suffered for killing their king resembles a 2nd and 3rd century Christian anti-Jewish polemic, parallels with Christian rhetoric. This is much more apparent there in the 2nd century. Portraying Jesus as in he's not, again, remember everything we've been through already on this channel. It's still in the 2nd century. They're figuring out whether this guy is even historical or not. Portraying Jesus as a lawgiver, death led to divine punishment for the Jews, is a familiar trope of the 2nd to 4th century Christian literature. Anachronistic mistakes about philosophers. Socrates and Pythagoras' deaths were described inaccurately, suggesting Mara relied on later retellings or schoolroom summaries rather than first-hand tradition. Christian influence possibility. The very phrase wise king of the Jews could reflect language shaped by Christian discourse of the 2nd century or later rather than a pagan observer of the first. Scholarly advocates, writers such as Peter Kirby and others have pressed for a 3rd or 4th century dating, noting that the text makes far more sense as a later rhetorical exercise influenced by Christian polemic rather than as an independent witness to Jesus. Thus, while an early date is possible, the evidence strongly favours a late composition. Okay, I did a Bayesian analysis here. So conservative priors favouring Jesus and a later date, 38% for Jesus. Jesus early 13%, and then Josiah 15%. This is on conservative, so it could be Josiah still. We don't know. Others 1 to 11%. Conservative chart. Fairer odds balance Jesus with others 50-50. Early late. So Jesus late 62% now. Okay, Jesus earlier 31%, so it's still more likely to be a late composition. And when we say early composition, what do we mean? Do we mean 100? Do we mean 110 or 20? When he could conceivably, Mara could conceivably have been hearing Christians talking. But again, if you look at some of the work I've been helping to synthesize, it doesn't even look that good. Certainly for a 72 CE remark, there's just too little known in the pagan world by 72 CE. This is even on conservative, like even on the consensus of Mark maybe being written in 70. Which is not true as far as I'm aware, then you don't really have too much to go on here. And remember, Mara is talking from, I think it's Syria, right? So not too far to be true, but it still just doesn't look right. Comparing conservative with fair priors, the two Bayesian runs highlight low prior shape outcomes. Conservative priors favour late dating and give more weight to alternatives. I don't have to read that. The conclusion then, again, the Bayesian balance indicates the wise king is almost certainly intended to be Jesus. Okay, fine. But the strong evidence strongly favours a late date, 2nd to 4th century for Mara's letter. It's not found until the 7th, remember. This means the passage is not an independent 1st century witness, but a later philosophical or semi-Christian reflection on Jesus cast in Stoic moral terms. So yeah, I'll just put that there then. I'll leave that there. I didn't want this to be a long video, but I thought it was important just to put down what the basic outline of this Mara Bar Serapion a reference was. Now, most people, most skeptics don't really give this much attention. I think it's worth putting out there. It's not, again, it's not a mention of Jesus Christ. The king epithet here, again, it sounds like a Christian, something a Christian would say, not a pagan. And it comes too early to be from 72. It's much more likely to be 2nd, 3rd, or 2nd or 3rd, really, century, or 4th, as this says. Anyway, I'll leave that there. Thank you very much. All right, take care now.